The ballroom was built to impress. Crystal chandeliers glittered like stars, casting soft light over velvet curtains, polished marble, and tables dressed in silver linen. It was the kind of event where wealth whispered rather than shouted, where every gesture was rehearsed and every guest arrived pre-approved. The annual Visionaries of Influence Gala was one of the city's most exclusive gatherings. It was where power shook hands with money and sealed deals behind the sparkle of champagne flutes. In the middle of it all stood Victor Delane, a billionaire industrialist, tech pioneer, and master of the room. His suits were stitched in Milan, his confidence inherited from generations of unchallenged dominance. Victor didn't just own companies, he owned narratives. When he entered a room, people adjusted their tone. When he raised his glass, they toasted. He was the celebration. So when Marissa Dwyer, a single mother in a borrowed dress, stepped quietly through the side entrance with a folded pamphlet in her purse and hope in her eyes, no one saw her as part of the picture. She didn't belong, at least not by their standards. Her shoes were second-hand, her posture determined but unsure. She had only been granted entry through a nonprofit partner's guest list, a mercy invite, the kind that adds diversity to a gala's photo reel. She wasn't there for spectacle. She was there to ask one question. Would anyone of influence help? Marissa had been building a small program to support displaced mothers, women like her, who had escaped abusive homes, fought through shelters, and now clawed toward survival with children at their side. The gala's theme was Innovation for Social Impact. She thought someone might listen. She waited for the speeches to finish, for the polite applause to settle. And when Victor took the stage and offered his rehearsed words about opportunity, she raised her hand. Not to disrupt, but to be heard. She asked, gently but clearly, if someone like him would consider funding real programs for single mothers. Not just tech schools and startup grants, but shelters, transitional housing, child care. Things that weren't glamorous, but necessary. There was a pause. Then Victor laughed. Not loudly, but with the unmistakable cadence of dismissal. He stepped off the stage with calculated grace, wineglass in hand, and approached her. The crowd parted, the music softened, cameras hovered. Everyone leaned in, sensing tension, waiting for a teachable moment or a witty burn. Victor stood inches from Marissa, towering in posture, oozing control. He swirled the wine in his glass, rich red, the kind that stains, and tilted his head. Then, without a word, he flung the contents straight at her. The wine splashed across her chest, her face, soaking her thin dress, turning it a violent crimson. The cold hit first, then the silence, then the sound of the glass clinking to the floor. Gasps filled the room. No one moved. Victor turned away, as if flicking a gnat. He walked back toward his table, face unreadable. He didn't look back. In his mind, the moment was done. But it wasn't. Marissa stood motionless, wine dripping from her chin, her hands clenched around the ruined pamphlet in her purse. Her face did not crumple. Her voice did not crack. She reached down, picked up the empty glass and placed it on a nearby tray. Then she turned, walked out past frozen faces, and disappeared into the night. No one stopped her. No one followed. That night, she took the long route home. Public buses, cold wind, her coat barely warm enough to hide the stains. She cried, not from shame, but from anger, from the clarity that no amount of preparation, presentation, or persistence would shield someone like her from being reduced to spectacle. The next morning, she did what she had always done. Woke early, packed her son's lunch, walked him to daycare, and clocked in at the diner where she worked nights. But something inside had changed. The wine hadn't just stained her dress. It had marked a threshold. She was done asking for permission. Done waiting for respect. If they wouldn't help her build the future she believed in, she'd build it herself, without them. She emptied her savings account, all 362 hours. Bought a used laptop, signed up for free online business courses, and drafted a name. The Other Side, a non-profit, but not like the others. This one wouldn't beg from billionaires. It would rise on the strength of mothers who had lived through the fire and chosen to walk forward anyway. She began with nothing but a website, a mission, and a will hardened by humiliation. She worked late into the night, typing proposals between diner shifts. She emailed women she had met in shelters, in court waiting rooms, in the subsidized clinics. She offered a plan: skills training, trauma counseling, safe housing links, job prep. No slogans, just results. In 3 months, she had her first donor, an anonymous woman who had seen her soaked in wine that night and never forgotten the look in her eyes. It wasn't pain. It was fire. That $5,000 check launched the pilot program. 10 women joined. 8 found jobs within a month. They met weekly, shared stories, cried, held each other up. And when reporters began sniffing around the story, the woman who got drenched in red wine by a billionaire, Marissa said nothing. She wasn't building a scandal. She was building a mirror, and soon the world would be forced to look into it. Victor Delane had forgotten the incident before he reached his town car. To him, it was a flick of the wrist, a demonstration, a correction. She had stepped out of line, dared to address him in public, and he'd made his point. No headlines followed, no legal letters arrived, and by the time dessert was served, he was laughing again with foreign dignitaries and hedge fund chairmen. His world didn't slow for the ones it crushed. It rolled on. But outside the ballroom, in a different world, the stain had begun to spread, not across the marble floor, but through quiet whispers, screenshots, and blurry phone videos. A guest at the gala, seated just 2 tables away, had captured it. Not the wine hitting Marissa, only the moment after. Her soaked dress, the gasps, the stillness in her face. It was uploaded without much thought. No hashtags, just a caption. "I think this moment will haunt me." Within 48 hours, the clip had been shared thousands of times, and then millions. No one knew Marissa's name. No one knew the billionaire had thrown the wine, though rumors surged. But everyone knew what they saw: a poor woman being humiliated in a room full of luxury, and no one stepping in. Marissa saw the video on her cracked phone screen late one night while reviewing grant applications for the tiny nonprofit she'd registered a week earlier. She didn't flinch watching it. She didn't comment. She turned off her phone and went back to work. But the world didn't stop spinning. A week later, a local journalist traced her identity through nonprofit records. A short blog post followed, then an op-ed, then an invite to appear on a morning news show. Marissa declined every interview. She didn't want to be a moment. She wanted to be a movement. She returned every day to the other side, which was still nothing more than a 2-room office space above a laundromat. She kept the stained dress, washed and folded, in the corner drawer of her desk, not as a trophy, but as evidence of how the world sees women like her, of how far she had come from being a spectacle to becoming a strategy. What she hadn't expected was how many others were watching. A woman named Layla Jenkins, once the CEO of a failing tech foundation, reached out privately. Layla had lost her company in a gender discrimination scandal but had quietly rebuilt herself through nonprofit work. She told Marissa she believed in what she was doing. She offered connections, strategy sessions, mentorship, no spotlight, just support. Marissa said yes. With Layla's help, she rewrote her proposals and restructured the nonprofit's model. What began as a mother-to-mother support circle evolved into a multi-tiered system, one that offered mental health counseling, professional development, legal aid for domestic survivors, and transitional housing partnerships. But it wasn't just the programming that changed. It was the perception. Her story, once seen as a dramatic viral moment, was now proof of potential. She had been humiliated by the powerful and used it to empower others. That shift caught attention far beyond her city. Philanthropic circles that once scoffed at small grassroots operations now whispered her name at galas. Women's leadership. Groups quoted her approach. Anonymous donors, many of them women who had once lived similar stories, began contributing quietly. No press, no names, just silent hands pushing the mission forward. Victor Delane remained unaware. He had assumed the story died after a week. His publicist had buried the video under waves of corporate PR and feel-good philanthropy posts. He'd given a speech about inclusive entrepreneurship at a conference in Zurich and believed the narrative had been erased, but it hadn't. Because Marissa hadn't spoken a word, and sometimes silence carries louder than sound. By the time Victor's name re-entered the conversation, it was too late. A documentary filmmaker, compiling stories of modern American resilience, released a teaser about a woman who transformed a public act of humiliation into one of the fastest-growing support systems for single mothers in the country. Marissa's face was still barely known, but her mission was now undeniable. The red wine had stopped dripping, but the stain had never disappeared. It had dried into fabric, absorbed by every woman who had ever been silenced, sidelined, or shamed for asking for help. And as for Marissa, she was still there, still walking into her 2-room office, still handing out grocery vouchers, still printing flyers herself because the nonprofit couldn't afford a full-time designer. But her impact? It now stretched across 5 states. One of her earliest clients had just launched a home cleaning business that partnered with domestic violence shelters to offer survivors paid work and housing. Another woman, once homeless with 3 kids, was now a licensed nurse and volunteered weekends to teach first aid at Marissa's workshops. And the stained dress. It remained in the drawer, but soon Marissa would move it to a frame. Not for her. For the women who walked in, scared and silent, thinking no one saw them. So they would know. This wasn't just wine. It was every time the world told them they were less and what it looks like when they rise anyway. Marissa never mentioned his name, even as her nonprofit expanded, even as whispers of the red wine incident followed her into community meetings and strategy rooms. She never once uttered Victor Delane's name. Not in interviews, not in grant proposals, not in speeches. While the world speculated, while headlines hinted and forums buzzed, she stayed silent, not out of fear, out of clarity. He wasn't the story. The story was every woman who had walked through the doors of the other side carrying more pain than paperwork. Women who'd left abusive marriages in the middle of the night. Women who had slept in their cars while filling out job applications. Women who had heard the word liability more often than potential. Those were the names she carried, and she protected them like sacred scrolls. Marissa didn't attend galas. She didn't pose for magazine covers. But she kept moving. The nonprofit that once fit inside a single dusty room above a laundromat now occupied an entire community building with 6 staff members, 3 satellite branches, and a rotating team of volunteers. Each wall inside the main office was lined with framed success stories. Not degrees, not fancy graphics, just plain white sheets printed with women's names and a single sentence describing where they had landed. April, hired as a city bus driver after 9 months of sleeping in her sedan. Nicolette opened her first bank account at 39. Tamika got her kids back. There were no filters, no false optimism, just truth. And truth, when amplified with compassion, became a force Victor couldn't touch. But that didn't stop him from trying. When a national journalist finally confirmed his identity as the man who'd thrown the wine, the article exploded across every major media platform. It wasn't a hit piece. It was a reckoning. The headline read, "The Billionaire, the Red Wine, and the Woman Who Built Without Him." It recounted the night with chilling clarity. A single mother's question met with liquid contempt, a crowd's silence, and a man's arrogance caught mid-gesture. Victor was asked for comment. He gave one, carefully crafted by a publicist. He called the event a misunderstanding, an unfortunate moment, and framed his action as a joke taken out of context. But the world had already moved past apologies. What mattered now was that he became a symbol, and not the one he was used to being. His investors began to pull back. Foundations that once courted him for gala seats rescinded invites. Corporate sponsors questioned their partnerships, not because of guilt, but because of perception. The image of a man throwing wine at a struggling woman was one they couldn't risk being adjacent to. And Marissa? She kept working. She expanded the job training program, partnered with local unions to create fast-track employment pipelines for single mothers, and launched a financial literacy series that became a statewide initiative. She never cashed in on the moment, never called out the man. She simply kept building what he never could, a legacy grounded in restoration. One of her most radical moves came that winter. She announced that the other side would begin offering grants to women wanting to start businesses, no matter their credit history, background, or education. The only requirement? They had to mentor another woman in the program for 1 year. It wasn't charity, it was reciprocity. It was a revolution disguised as kindness. The stories that followed were powerful. A former dishwasher launched a catering business that now served events across 3 counties. A woman who had aged out of the foster system and lived in shelters most of her adult life opened a mobile hair salon. A mother of 4 began tutoring middle school math students online and now made more than she ever had before. Each of them had walked in carrying bags of shame, fear, and invisible trauma. Each of them walked out carrying possibility. Victor watched it unfold from afar. He was advised to donate, to apologize again, to launch his own women's initiative. And he tried. He funded a startup accelerator program and invited social entrepreneurs to apply. But no matter what he did, no matter how many zeros he added, to the checks his efforts felt hollow, because none of it was born from belief. It was all born from guilt. Meanwhile, Marissa's name began to show up on lists. Quiet ones. People to watch. Leaders shaping the future. She declined most features. When asked for quotes, she gave them only if it meant the women in her program could be named instead. She turned down a major book deal, said no to 3 documentary filmmakers. When a celebrity offered to fund her entire next phase if she appeared at their gala, she respectfully passed. Her power came from remaining rooted, not from trading her past for a podium. Then, one evening, during a winter ceremony at the city's Community Leadership Awards, she received a standing ovation, not for what she had survived, but for what she had built. When she stepped to the podium to accept the honor, she didn't mention the wine, or the man, or the viral video. She mentioned a moment. She said, "There are times when the world throws something at you to break you, and if you can hold steady long enough, not for revenge but for purpose, you might just build something stronger from the pieces." That was all. No spectacle, no scandal, just truth. And the truth was this. Victor had thrown a glass of wine expecting it to silence her. Instead, it baptized a leader the world could no longer ignore. The photo of her standing behind the podium traveled, quietly through social media. No dramatic filters, no fancy lighting. Just Marissa in a plain navy blazer, standing with her head slightly bowed, clutching the award as though she didn't quite know what to do with it. The caption underneath read, "From forgotten to formidable." The city began to take notice, not just of her, but of the movement she'd built. Within 6 months, the other side had partnered with local high schools to provide resources for teenage mothers and girls in foster care. Within a year, they opened their first transitional housing complex, a modest 4-story building called Anchor House, where mothers could stay for up to a year with their children while they trained, healed, and rebuilt. Marissa didn't attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Instead, she watched from across the street, standing quietly in her coat, letting the women who now ran the program take the stage. She believed in handing over the mic, not to the loudest, but to the ones who had always been told to be quiet. Her model was clear: build it, strengthen it, and then move aside to make room for others to rise. By now, Victor Delane's name had re-entered the public conversation, but not in the way he expected. Podcasts dissected his fall from grace. Panel discussions referenced the red wine moment as a turning point in corporate accountability. University lectures used the incident as a modern parable about arrogance, power, and consequence. And the irony? The man who once controlled entire rooms with a nod had lost control of his own narrative. Victor attempted to steer the story. He funded new initiatives, hired a full-time social impact team, even launched a women's tech scholarship with his name on it. But every time he tried to speak publicly about transformation, people asked about Marissa, and every time he tried to reference her without saying her name, it only made the contrast more visible. Because the more he tried to reframe the past, the more clearly the world saw what she had done with it. Marissa, meanwhile, had never once looked back. Her son was now in middle school. She picked him up every afternoon after work, helped with homework, made dinner from scratch when she had time. Fame hadn't changed their life. It had merely illuminated it. She still lived in the same modest duplex, still drove the same second-hand car, still folded laundry late at night while planning the next grant proposal. But beneath that quiet, rhythm pulsed a legacy growing larger than even she imagined. In year 3 of her nonprofit, she launched the Rise Network, a collaborative of women-led organizations sharing resources, training, and funding models. It expanded into 5 states, connecting dozens of community groups that had never been given access to major donors. The model was so effective, it began to draw attention from academic circles, government bodies, and global nonprofits looking to replicate the structure. Still, she remained out of sight, never at the front, always holding the ladder, never demanding to be the one climbing it. Then came the invitation she hadn't expected. The Ashbury Human Impact Prize, one of the most respected global recognitions in the nonprofit world, announced her as a finalist. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, addressed simply to Marissa Dwyer, founder. Her team gasped when they saw it. Her program coordinator wept. They had never even known someone had nominated her. At first, Marissa hesitated. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't want the attention. But then she thought of the wine. Not the humiliation. Not the man. But the moment itself. That sting. That silence. That crowd who watched and did nothing. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into a room of power, not to seek approval, but to carry every woman who'd ever been thrown out of it. So she said yes. The ceremony was elegant, understated, broadcast online, but closed to the public. Her name was called. She walked the stage slowly, wearing a simple black dress with no designer label. Her speech was brief. 32 seconds. She didn't thank institutions. She didn't reference injustice. She simply said, "You don't need to be handed a seat at the table. Sometimes you build your own table, and then you pull up chairs for the ones still standing." Applause followed. Standing ovation. And yet, back home, nothing changed. She returned to her office the next morning and spent 2 hours helping a mother apply for housing. She answered emails herself. She brought in lunch from a local soup kitchen she had partnered with, because this wasn't a story of triumph over a man. It was a story of triumph over a mindset, a culture that measures people by polish, that sees poverty as character flaw, that believes dignity belongs only to those who wear it loud. Victor watched the award clip on his phone. Alone. He didn't slam the screen. He didn't call a press agent. He simply sat there staring at the woman he once thought was disposable, the woman he drenched in wine as a lesson. And he realized the lesson had been his, because everything he had tried to erase with a glass of alcohol had become permanent. Not because she fought, but because she refused to. She refused to fight him for a headline, refused to climb through shame, refused to make herself small enough to fit into the role he'd written for her. Instead, she rewrote the stage, and now, every time the world talks about impact, justice, and transformation, it echoes not with his name, but with the sound of a glass hitting marble, and a woman rising without a word. The framed dress hung silently in the corner of the main hallway at the other side, not spotlighted, not labeled, just there, behind clean glass, wrinkled at the sleeves, stained across the chest with a dried streak of red that had long since stopped resembling wine. It was never explained to visitors, and yet every woman who passed it seemed to understand. It was a symbol, not of what had happened to Marissa, but of what hadn't. It hadn't broken her. It hadn't defined her, and most importantly, it hadn't stopped her. Years had passed since the gala, since the stain, since the billionaire who had thrown a glass of alcohol at her in front of the powerful and the silent. The moment that had once hung over her like a storm cloud now barely registered in the world she had built. It lived only in archives and echo chambers, while Marissa lived in motion. The other side had grown far beyond its original vision. What began as a one-room effort to help single mothers gain independence had become a national infrastructure of recovery and empowerment. Satellite campuses had opened in 8 states. A digital platform now offered virtual support groups, crisis assistance, and mentorship matching in over 30 communities. But none of this was slick. None of it was branded with her face. Marissa remained behind the scenes, coordinating funding, supporting her team, and occasionally sweeping the floors when events ran late. She refused to allow the institution to become a reflection of her alone. She built systems so that no woman's safety, healing, or future would ever depend on just one person again. Meanwhile, Victor Delane's world had thinned out. His business survived, but it no longer inspired awe. The board meetings still convened, the acquisitions still occurred, but the magnetism was gone. His name, once synonymous with foresight and force, now lingered at the edge of memory like a brand people no longer wore. He hadn't thrown another drink in public. He hadn't lashed out again. But it didn't matter, because he never apologized where it mattered. He tried everything to reframe the past, new campaigns, new causes, even a philanthropic startup named after his mother. But it rang hollow. No matter how many buildings bore his name, none of them felt like redemption, because he still hadn't grasped what Marissa had taught the world without speaking it. That power isn't taken from those who have it. It's surrendered by those who never knew how to carry it. And Marissa, she had learned how to carry it in silence, in service, in rooms no cameras entered. She declined most awards now, passed speaking engagements to other women. She sent one of her staff members, a former abuse survivor named Jenna, to speak at a national summit on re-entry support for formerly incarcerated mothers. Jenna had never been on a plane before, but she walked the stage with calm and clarity, her voice shaped by truth, not training. Marissa watched the stream from her office, tears in her eyes, not from pride, but from awe. She hadn't built followers. She had built leaders. And the system that once rejected her had been forced to reckon with the blueprint she created in defiance. Then, one morning, a letter arrived from a small city in another state. It came from a mayor's office. Inside, a modest certificate declaring that the other side would now be a permanent partner in the city's new Center for Women's Empowerment. It was the first time a government institution had adopted her full model, unmodified, untouched. Marissa placed the letter in a drawer beside her son's old drawings and the first grant check she ever received. It reminded her that permanence, didn't come from force. It came from faith and repetition. Every act of service, every hard choice, every woman who walked in with a tremble and walked out with a stride. That same week, she visited Anchor House for its third-year anniversary. The walls had been repainted. The kitchen now bustled with laughter and cinnamon-scented bread. A mother who once arrived barefoot now led the wellness program. A teenage mom who'd been expelled from high school now mentored other young girls through the GED process. As Marissa walked the halls, the women nodded, but not in awe, in recognition. She wasn't a hero here, she was family, and when she passed the framed dress in the hall, no one said a word. They didn't need to, because it was no longer just hers. It was theirs. The following year, the other side launched an international version of the program in partnership with a women's refugee organization. The pilot began in Nairobi, then expanded to Manila, then Sao Paulo. The same structure, the same mentorship, no credit-seeking, just results. Victor watched this unfold from afar. A photo circulated. Marissa standing beside women from 4 countries, all in matching volunteer shirts, smiling under a hand-painted mural that read, "Nothing thrown at us will bury us. We rise through roots." He read it 3 times, and then, for the first time, he felt something different. Not fear, not embarrassment, but silence. A deep, aching silence that came from realizing he had underestimated the wrong person. He had mistaken softness for submission, kindness for weakness, quiet for irrelevance. And by the time he realized the difference, the world had already changed without him. Marissa returned to her office that night, tucked in her son, and folded her hands across her lap. She thought of that night, long ago, the wine, the silence, the cold walk home. And she smiled. Not because she had won, but because she had turned a moment meant to humiliate her into a legacy no man could erase. And somewhere, in rooms she'd never step into, a new generation of women now stood taller, because she had once refused to step down.